Before you can plant a garden, before you can build that fence, before you can even mow your own backyard without dodging it, there it sits. A stump. Maybe it has been there since the people who owned your house before you cut the tree down and never finished the job. Maybe a storm took the tree last year, and the company that hauled away the branches told you stump removal would cost another $800. So you said you would deal with it later. Later turned into this spring, and now you are standing over it again with a shovel in your hand, sweat already soaking through your shirt before 9 in the morning, hacking at roots that seem to multiply every time you cut one. Your kids trip over it when they play. Your lawnmower has a permanent dent from the time you misjudged how close you could get. You have looked up rental prices for a stump grinder and nearly choked on the number. And the idea of paying a tree service to bring out an excavator for one ugly chunk of wood feels almost embarrassing. So you wonder, the way people have wondered for centuries, whether there is a better way. There is, and the strange thing is that the answer was not invented by a giant machine company with unlimited money. It was invented by ordinary people who were just as exhausted and just as broke as you are right now, generations before anyone had ever heard the word bulldozer. And the story of how they solved it is one of those small, almost invisible moments in history that quietly reshaped an entire continent. In the autumn of 1877, in the rough lumber town of Escanaba, on the shore of Lake Michigan, a blacksmith named Andrew Kirsten stood at the edge of his own 5-acre plot of land and stared at a problem that had nothing to do with iron or fire. Kirsten was 34 years old, a practical man with thick forearms and a head for mechanics, and his trouble was small and specific. He needed to grow potatoes. He had a family to feed, a wife and several children, and the only land he could afford was land that the logging companies had already stripped of every white pine worth cutting. What they left behind was not a clean field. It was a battlefield of stumps, some of them 4 feet across, rooted so deeply into the clay and rock that no single man and no single horse stood a real chance against them. Kirsten did not set out to change the history of farming in North America. He just wanted his potatoes in the ground before the first frost, and he was tired of losing entire weekends to a single tree that had been dead for years. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to picture what the land actually looked like before anyone solved this problem properly. Through the middle of the 1800s, the upper Midwest of the United States, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, had been covered in old-growth white pine forest, so dense that early travelers wrote about sunlight barely reaching the ground at midday. Lumber companies tore through these forests with astonishing speed, feeding sawmills that shipped wood to build the booming cities of Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. Within a few decades, millions of acres that had once been forest were reduced to what settlers grimly nicknamed stump prairies. Imagine driving for hours and seeing nothing but gray, rotting stumps stretching to the horizon in every direction, fields that looked less like farmland and more like a graveyard for trees. For the families who came afterward, lured by cheap land under the Homestead Act of 1862, this was the inheritance they received. A farmer could buy 160 acres for almost nothing, but before a single seed went into the ground, that land had to be cleared. And clearing it meant fighting stumps that could weigh several tons and whose root systems sometimes spread 30 feet in every direction underground. The methods available before machines like Kirsten's were brutal and slow. Some farmers piled brush around a stump and set it on fire, letting it smolder for days or even weeks, hoping the heat would eventually destroy enough of the root mass that the stump could be pried loose. This worked eventually, but it filled the air with smoke for miles, and sometimes the fire spread where it was not wanted, burning fences, barns, and on more than one documented occasion, entire sections of forest that someone had hoped to save. Other farmers hitched teams of oxen, sometimes 4 or 6 animals straining together, chained directly to the stump in the hope of simply ripping it from the earth by brute force. This occasionally worked on smaller stumps, but it also occasionally killed the oxen, snapping their legs or their spirits when the chain held and the stump did not move an inch. Black powder and later dynamite became popular by the 1870s, and while explosives could shatter a stump in seconds, they were dangerous in untrained hands, expensive for a struggling family, and prone to throwing chunks of wood and rock with enough force to kill a man standing too close. A government survey from the period estimated that clearing a single acre of stump-covered land by hand could take a farmer and his family the better part of an entire winter. Working every spare hour they had, between other chores, needed simply to survive. Multiply that by the millions of acres waiting to be settled, and you start to understand the scale of frustration that an entire generation carried with them every single day. Andrew Kirsten had grown up around machinery, not farming, and that background gave him a different way of looking at the problem. Instead of trying to overpower a stump with brute force, fire, or explosives, he asked a quieter, more mechanical question. What if the trick was not strength at all, but leverage? Anyone who has ever used a long pry bar to move something far heavier than they could lift on their own already understands the basic principle. A small force applied at the end of a long enough lever can move an enormous weight, as long as there is something solid to push against. Kirsten began experimenting in his own blacksmith shop with a design built around a heavy iron frame, a long lever arm, and a winding drum wrapped with strong cable. The operator anchored the device to the ground near the stump, wrapped the cable around the stump or its main roots, and then walked the lever arm around and around in a slow circle, the same way a person might wind an old well bucket, except every turn multiplied the pulling force many times over. A single man, or sometimes a horse, walking in a wide circle attached to the lever, could generate pulling force that would have required a dozen oxen working in dangerous unison only a few years earlier. The early versions were rough, built more for Kirsten's own potato field than for sale, and there were plenty of small failures along the way. One of his earliest cable anchors slipped under tension, and the lever arm whipped around so fast it nearly took off a neighbor's arm, a moment that, according to local stories passed down in Escanaba for years afterward, terrified Kirsten enough that he spent the following winter almost entirely redesigning the locking mechanism rather than risk hurting anyone again. That near accident, as frightening as it was, became the turning point that pushed his crude backyard tool into something safer, sturdier, and eventually patentable. By the early 1880s, word of his stump puller had spread well beyond his own property line. Neighbors who had watched him clear his potato field in days instead of months started asking to borrow the machine, then asking to buy one of their own. And Kirsten, the blacksmith who had only wanted to feed his family, found himself running something closer to a small manufacturing business, almost by accident. This is where the first wave of impact begins, and it is worth slowing down here because it changed an entire industry almost overnight. Within a decade, dozens of competing stump puller companies sprang up across the Midwest and into the Plains states, each one claiming to be faster, cheaper, or stronger than the last. Catalogs from the period advertised devices with names meant to sound almost heroic. Machines marketed under titles suggesting unstoppable strength, sold through mail order to farmers who had never owned a piece of mechanical equipment more complicated than a plow. Prices ranged widely, but a basic horse-powered stump puller in the 1890s could be purchased for somewhere between $20 and $40, a substantial sum for a homesteading family, but a fraction of the cost in time and risk compared to dynamite or months of burning. Farm equipment dealers in small frontier towns reported that stump pullers became one of their best-selling pieces of machinery for an entire generation, often outselling more glamorous equipment like reapers or threshers, simply because clearing land had to happen before any of that other machinery was even useful. The logging industry itself took notice too. Companies that had previously simply abandoned cut-over land, considering it worthless once the timber was gone, began selling that same land to settlers at a markup once it became known that a determined family with one of these machines could turn a stump field into productive farmland within a single season instead of a decade. By the way, if stories like this one, about the strange small inventions that quietly rebuilt the world around us are the kind of thing that keeps you curious long after the video ends. It really does mean a lot when you stick around and subscribe to this channel. This is a space built for people who like digging past the obvious version of history, who want to understand the real human moments behind the things we take for granted, and every subscriber genuinely helps keep these stories coming, with no pressure and nothing expected in return, except that you keep showing up curious. The second wave of impact moved beyond machinery sales and into the daily rhythm of entire communities. Before efficient stump pulling existed, clearing land was so exhausting that many homesteading families simply gave up. Historical records from land offices in Michigan, Wisconsin, and later the Dakotas show abandonment rates on certain claims reaching as high as 1 in 3 during the hardest years of the stump prairie era. Families who had traveled hundreds of miles built a small cabin and then walked away because the land itself refused to be tamed in time to grow enough food to survive the winter. Once stump pulling became fast, affordable, and relatively safe, that calculation changed dramatically. Families who might have abandoned a claim instead managed to clear enough acreage in their first year to plant a real crop, and successful first harvests meant families stayed, which meant towns grew, schools opened, churches were built, and entire regions that had been considered nearly unsettleable suddenly filled with permanent communities. The social ripple went further than just survival. Clearing land faster meant a farmer's children spent less time pulling roots and more time in school, since families no longer needed every able body working stumps from dawn until dark for years at a time. Local historians in parts of rural Wisconsin have noted that school attendance records in several counties show a measurable rise during the same decades that stump pulling machinery became common, a connection that seems almost too small to matter until you realize how many other things depend on a child actually being able to attend school instead of working land. Migration patterns shifted too. Word traveled back east and even across the ocean to immigrant communities in Scandinavia and Germany that land in the American Midwest, while difficult, was no longer impossible to clear within a reasonable amount of time. And immigration records from the period show a noticeable increase in settlers heading specifically toward regions known for cutover pine land, regions that had been considered undesirable just a generation earlier. From there, the impact climbed into something closer to political and economic structure, the kind of change that shows up in laws, land values, and the shape of entire state economies. As cleared farmland expanded rapidly across formerly logged regions, agricultural output from these areas grew at a pace that surprised even optimistic government surveyors. Wisconsin, which had been thought of primarily as a logging state, transformed within a few decades into one of the country's leading dairy and grain-producing regions, a shift that simply would not have been possible at that speed if every acre still required months of backbreaking labor to clear a single stump field. Land values in formerly worthless stump prairie regions rose substantially once buyers understood that clearing costs had dropped so dramatically, and local governments adjusted tax assessments accordingly, generating new revenue that funded roads, railroads, and county infrastructure that further accelerated settlement. Railroad companies, always eager to sell land grants along their routes, began explicitly advertising the availability of mechanical stump pullers as a selling point in their promotional pamphlets aimed at attracting settlers from the eastern states and from Europe, a detail that shows just how central this single invention had become to the broader economic engine of westward expansion. Political debates of the era, particularly around homesteading policy and land grant reform, increasingly assumed that clearing technology existed and was accessible, a quiet assumption baked into legislation that earlier generations of lawmakers could never have taken for granted. In a very real sense, the speed and confidence with which the American Midwest filled in during the late 19th century, with all the political weight that population growth carried in terms of statehood, congressional representation, and national agricultural policy, rested partly on a blacksmith's decision in 1877 to stop fighting his potato field with fire and oxen and start fighting it with leverage instead. The fourth wave, the one that stretches all the way to where we stand today, takes this small Michigan story and spreads it across the entire planet. The basic principle Kirsten refined, using mechanical leverage and winding force instead of raw muscle to move enormous weight, did not stay confined to stump pulling for long. Engineers working on land-clearing equipment in the early 20th century borrowed directly from these winch and lever designs as they began experimenting with engine-powered alternatives. By the 1920s, gasoline-powered tractors were being fitted with cable winches explicitly modeled on the same physics as the old horse-powered stump pullers, simply replacing the slow, circular walk of a horse with the steady torque of an engine. This line of mechanical thinking fed directly into the development of the modern bulldozer in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when companies began mounting heavy steel blades onto tracked tractors capable of pushing entire stumps, boulders, and earth out of the way in a single pass, a task that would have seemed like science fiction to a frontier farmer in the 1880s. Within a single human lifetime, the technology had gone from a single blacksmith pulling potato stumps with a hand-cranked lever to massive machines capable of clearing forests at a scale that reshaped continents, used to build everything from interstate highways to suburban housing developments to airstrips during 2 world wars. Land-clearing technology that traces its lineage back through devices like Kirsten's eventually became one of the foundational tools of global infrastructure development, used not just in the United States, but across South America, Africa, and Asia, wherever forests stood in the way of farmland, roads, or cities. And yet, as is so often the case with these stories, the very success of this technology eventually created problems that nobody in 1877 could have imagined. The same efficiency that allowed stumps to be removed in minutes instead of months also made large-scale deforestation dramatically easier and faster, accelerating land clearing to a pace that, in many regions throughout the 20th century, badly outran any concern for soil health or ecological balance. Soil scientists in the decades following the Great Stump Prairie Clearing eventually documented serious erosion problems across parts of the upper Midwest. Problems traced directly back to land that had been stripped of both trees and stumps so completely and so quickly that nothing remained to hold topsoil in place during heavy rains. A slow-motion consequence of a solution that had seemed purely beneficial at the time. Forest ecologists today have also identified something quietly ironic happening in modern conservation circles, where land managers in certain regions now deliberately leave stumps and dead wood in place rather than removing them, recognizing that decaying stumps support insect populations, fungi, and small mammal habitats that healthy forest ecosystems actually depend on. The very thing that generations of farmers fought so hard to eliminate from their land is now, in carefully chosen contexts, something conservationists work hard to preserve, a strange full circle that the exhausted homesteaders of the 1880s could never have predicted and probably would not have believed if you told them. Today, the modern version of this same old problem looks almost nothing like Andrew Kirsten's hand-cranked lever, yet it solves exactly the same need that drove him to his blacksmith shop nearly 150 years ago. Homeowners can rent gasoline-powered stump grinders that chew a stump down to wood chips in under an hour. Tree service companies operate hydraulic excavators capable of ripping an entire root ball from the ground in a single smooth motion. And chemical stump removal products promise to soften even the toughest hardwood roots over a period of weeks without any heavy machinery at all. The fundamental tension remains unchanged though. Stumps are still stubborn, still deeply rooted, still capable of ruining an otherwise pleasant Saturday for anyone who underestimates them. And people today still stand over them the exact same way frontier farmers once did, wondering if there is an easier way, and usually discovering that there is, once they know where to look. Which brings the story back, in the end, to that same patch of land near Escanaba in 1877, where a tired blacksmith named Andrew Kirsten stood looking at a stump field he simply needed cleared in time to plant potatoes before the frost came. He was not trying to reshape American agriculture. He was not thinking about railroads, statehood, soil erosion, or the future invention of the bulldozer. He was thinking about feeding his family before winter and about a smarter way to move something heavy without breaking his back or his animals doing it. That narrow, almost forgettable moment of practical frustration quietly set in motion changes that rippled outward through farms, towns, economies, and eventually entire continents, proving once again that history rarely announces its biggest turning points in advance. Most of the time, they look exactly like an ordinary man in an ordinary field, simply trying to solve one small problem in front of him.